In this video, we're going to be tying a fly called the Muddler Minnow. It is a streamer pattern. First thing we're going to do is we're going to start off with a nice long hook. We're going to use a 3x or a 4x long streamer hook. Then we're going to take our thread and we're going to start it at about the 75% point from the back of the bend there. And all we're going to do is just build a quick thin thread base. I usually just kind of spiral my thread back down to the bend. And now we're ready for our first material, which is the tail material. And for this we're going to use some mottled turkey feathers. And we're going to trim 2 pieces from the turkey feather, and then we're going to marry them up together. It looks like one piece in my fingers, but it is actually 2 pieces. And I take the 2 pieces and I place the curve so that they both curve towards each other, and the more colorful and more mottled part of the feather will face out. And then we're going to tie in a tail. I want it to be about 25 to 30% of the length of the shank. I'm going to take this feather and I'm going to place it on top of the hook shank. I'm going to pinch it into place very, very firmly. And I'm just going to take a loose wrap of thread. I'm just going to let the thread hang there, and I want to make sure that this feather is right on top of the shank of the hook. I can do so by just kind of pulling the feather up, and then I can bite down nice and tight with my thread. It's important that you do that little trick with pinching very firmly to make sure that the feather does not roll from side to side. Then I just simply wrap my thread forward on the shank of the hook. I do so over the butt ends of the turkey. That way I have a nice smooth body still. Now the next thing to do is we're going to tie in the body material, which is just gold diamond flat braid. You can also use gold Mylar tinsel for this. You can also use gold flashaboo. I found that this gold braid is actually a little easier to work with. So I just tie that in right at the front there, and I'm going to take this gold braid and I'm going to work my way back, pulling nice and tight on the braid. And then I'm going to take it all the way to the tail. Once I reach that tail, I'm just going to take the braid and work my way forward. If you like a bit of a tapered body, you can kind of build it up. Once I get to the end here, I can just capture that braid with my thread and trim it out of there. Now the next thing we're going to tie in is going to be our prop material. This material just kind of helps the wing of the fly that we're going to tie in next after the prop. It'll help the wing stand up and it'll keep its profile. And for that you can use a few different types of materials. I've seen guys use calf tail hair. I'm actually going to use a little bit of bucktail from the middle of a white bucktail. And I'm just going to trim out a few fibers. This is meant to be fairly sparse. We don't want to tie in too many. Only about 15-20 fibers or so. We're going to tie this in so that it just reaches the halfway point of our tail there. I just kind of pull out any of the under fibers. So I'm just going to take it and tie it right on top of the shank of the hook. You can trim out the butt ends. There we go. Now the next thing to do is we're going to take another piece of mottled turkey. This piece I'm going to use is a little bit thicker. It's going to be about two to three times thicker or wider than the tail section. I'm going to use two pieces just as I did the tail. I'm just going to marry them up. Then we're going to lay our wing on our fly here, and again I want the tip of this to reach back over halfway past the tail. We're going to tie this in using the same technique as we did the tail. I'm going to pinch nice and tight. Then I can secure the butt ends. Now the last thing I'm going to do before we get to the head here is I'm actually going to switch thread. The thread I'm using right now is a UTC 70. It's great for keeping a slim profile, but it's not so good for spinning deer hair. So I just tie it off. If you have another bobbin handy, that makes things a little bit faster. I use my Mark Pettigene bobbin, so it's pretty easy to quickly load, unload, and switch threads because I can just thread it without a threader. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take some deer hair in natural, and we're going to take a generous clump of about the diameter of a pencil, and we're going to put it inside of a hair stacker to even up all the tips. Now we want the tip part of our feathers to be a bit of a collar. We want this collar to reach back about halfway past the halfway down the body that we've tied already. So I just kind of roughly measure it out. I'll pinch it with my fingers, and then I'm going to trim the butt ends. I want when I spin the deer hair fibers, I want those collar fibers to hang back, and I want the butt ends to form the spun head. But if they're too long, they'll all blend together inside the tips of those deer hair fibers, and it'll make it harder for me to trim the deer hair head without trimming those collar fibers. So what I do is I just trim those deer hair fibers so that they're going to be nice and short when I spin the deer hair. So now I just simply take my clump of deer hair, I'm just going to place it on my thread or on the hook, take a loose wrap of thread, take a second loose wrap of thread, then I can let go. I'm just going to let it all spin onto the shank. Then before I take too many wraps forward, I'm going to take my thread, I'm going to work my way through the front of the deer hair. I'm going to pull all the deer hair back. Then I'll lay down some nice tight wraps right in front. And we have kind of the first portion of our deer hair head. Now you can kind of see what I meant by those fibers. The nice long collared fibers are sticking back, and I can tell the difference between those long fibers and these butt ends of the deer hair. Now we're going to continue to form our head. I'm going to take another generous clump of deer hair. I want to make sure I remove all the under fur. And this time I'm actually going to trim the tips off. That way they do not get confused with my tips on the collar of the fly. So I'm just going to use just the butt ends. And I'm going to lay the deer hair right on the shank of the hook, do two loose wraps, and I can pull tight and let the deer hair spin. And I just keep wrapping my thread through the deer hair. Once I've got it secure, I'm going to take my thread and again work it to the front portion of the deer hair. Then I'm going to pull all the deer hair back, and then again lay down some nice tight wraps right in front of the deer hair. Now I have a little bit of hook left there. Depending on the size you tie, sometimes you can get it done in just 2 stages of deer hair. Sometimes it takes 3. I'm tying on a nice big chunky hook, a size 4 here. So this one's going to take 3 rounds of deer hair. So I just repeat the same process that I just did. Trim out the tips. Lay the deer hair on the shank. Take 2 loose wraps, and I can let the deer hair spin. And then again, I'm just going to work the thread forward, this time until I get to the eye. I'll pull all that deer hair back, build up a little bit of a thread dam. Then I can actually get in here and whip finish. It's a little tricky to whip finish. You actually have to hold all the hair back with one hand while you get your whip finish in there. If you want, you can actually half hitch and then just give it a nice healthy dose of super glue or head cement if you don't want to do the whip finish. And then you can trim your thread out of there. Now the last step is to trim the fly. Some guys will use a razor blade. I prefer just to use my scissors. I actually use a pair of curved scissors. That helps a little bit. And all I'm going to do is just trim the butt ends of the deer hair. Now how you trim is up to you. If you're looking for a nice wide profiled kind of sculpin fly, you can trim your muddler so that it has that wide profile. Traditionally, a lot of them have thinner profiles. So if you're going for more of a traditional look, you can trim it down. Curved scissors. I actually do pretty good work. I actually prefer them to the razor blade. The razor blade takes a little bit of work, a little bit of getting used to. So there's a nice wide chunky muddler head. Like I said, if you don't like it chunky, you can trim it down much more than this. I like mine usually a little chunkier. If you've ever seen a picture of a sculpin, it is a very wide-headed baitfish pattern. I like my muddlers to push a lot of water, make a lot of ruckus as it's going through the water, just as a sculpin would. But like I said, it's just personal preference. And on the muddler, you do have to be careful not to over trim. I've been guilty of that, still am guilty of that a lot of the times. Kind of have to know when to leave good enough alone and just stop. All I'm doing now though is just kind of evening up all the tips, trying to get that head as symmetrical as possible. But sometimes you do take a trim and you kind of go a little too much. But just with practice you'll kind of learn when to stop, when to keep trimming. That is the muddler. Actually a fairly difficult fly to tie, despite its appearance and its looks of being simplistic. It is a bit tricky to tie and get used to tying them, but once you do get it, I've tied only probably a handful of these in my life, only a dozen or so, and after about a dozen you can get the hang of it pretty good. Spinning the deer hair is probably the trickiest part, and understanding how to separate the collar from the butt ends. That little trick of leaving the collar longer and just using a short section of butt ends is a great trick. It makes it very easy to separate the two. That is probably the biggest mistake a lot of guys make when they're tying a muddler, is their collar either gets trimmed or disappeared. The other trick of pinching the turkey feather is the other big trick. You want to make sure you pinch that very firmly when you're tying it in. But classic fly, it's caught a lot of fish for me over the years, and you can find the materials to tie the muddler on our website, intheriffle.com. That is the Muddler Minnow.